engage students in and out of the classroom. My name is Megan Fields, and I'm an instructor here in public speaking, and I'd like to take a moment to introduce our three panelists this morning. First, we have Dr. Carolyn Hank from the School of Information Sciences here at UT. She teaches in the area of digital curation, human information interactions, and research methods. And today she's going to share findings on students' perceptions and practices for informally interacting on Facebook. Next, we have Dr. Karen Freberg. She is an assistant professor in strategic communication at the University of Louisville. She's published in several book chapters and in academic journals such as Public Relations Review. She also serves as the editorial board for Psychology for Popular Media, Culture, and Case Studies in Strategic Communication. Finally, we have Dr. Nick Bowman, who's an assistant professor in communication studies and research associate in the Media and Interaction Lab at West Virginia University. And his research centers around evolving relationships between humans and technology, and he's published over 36 studies and 12 book chapters related to the topic. Formerly, he was in public relations, political lobbying, radio broadcasting, and a newspaper reporter. So let's welcome our three panelists, and beginning with Dr. Carolyn Hank.
Hi everyone, my name is Carolyn Hank, and my office is about 20 feet away. So if anybody wants to ever talk to me about what we're talking about today, come on down in Suite 420. Chank at UTK if you want to get a hold of me. And what I'm going to talk about today is more so the out of the classroom when we think about social media and social networking site usage in higher education settings. So, do you Facebook? Do you tweet? If you're a college student, of course, most likely, as we saw by the hands, you answered yes. And of course, this plays in line with the research that we see in social networking site, or SNS, adoption and social media use. This is even a dated study at this point that 59% of adult U.S. internet users use one or more social networks. And in terms of which one they're using, the predominant social network of choice is Facebook. And it's not just, of course, students and others. Your faculty are on Facebook, too. And maybe some of you have had that experience, whether from a student perspective or a faculty perspective, and that is accidentally bumping into your faculty or your students informally in social-mediated spaces like Facebook. And that's what some of my research looks at and what I'm going to actually concentrate on today. My research has been motivated when we think about Facebookese or Facebook lingo by this notion of friend. So are faculty and students friends? Quote fingers? What do you think? Maybe, depends on who. Friendly might be a better way to put it. We do know there's been research coming out in the past several years about how social networking sites and social media are used in the classroom for engaging, for enhancing teaching and learning. However, there's been very little research. And we also know about how college students use Facebook, Twitter, et cetera. And as you saw from the study findings that I just shared on the slide, we also know a little bit about how faculty use Facebook and other social networks. But we don't actually know much about how they use them together in informal ways. And when I say informal, I mean outside of the classroom, outside of our college hallways. Many of you may have had the experience, I had it in the old school days of my undergraduate, of running into my faculty member at the grocery store, in a public park, at a bar. You know, and I remember as an undergraduate being a little bit uncomfortable, unsure about these informal interactions. Well, now we find ourselves bumping into each other on social spaces like Facebook. So that's one of my current studies right now, looking at how faculty and students informally interact or choose not to interact in Facebook. We did interviews, focus group interviews, and one-on-one interviews with faculty and graduate students from 3 schools of information science. And we are right now, knock on, is this real wood? We just had a paper submitted pending revision. So I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the findings from that study during the panel Q&A. But what I want to do is just give some context behind the motivations for my research, and hopefully it'll serve as some food for thought for all of you, of course, during this panel, throughout Social Media Week, but also beyond. And again, I'm not going to talk explicitly about using social network sites or social media in the classroom, though I do want to share that my own preference and my own practices as an instructor, as an assistant professor, is that I don't use it in my classroom. One of my areas of research and teaching, instructional expertise, is on digital preservation and digital curation. I'm uncomfortable asking students to commit to terms of service agreements when incorporating assignments, activities, communication via Facebook or Twitter. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I return to terms of service agreements. In no way is that an endorsement against using social media or social networking sites in the classroom, or an endorsement for. It is my own personal preference. And again, I'll return to that in a little bit. But going back to this notion of informal meetups or the potential for informal interactions via Facebook and other social networking sites, this is the context and some of the food for thought to give. We know academic freedom. It's a very important freedom at institutions of higher education, whether it's well documented or not. And it reflects in part, of course, the First Amendment and our right to freedom of speech or freedom of expression. And I think we can probably all agree, right? First Amendment, pretty awesome. Yep, John McNair, thumbs up. So it's pretty awesome, but sometimes the speech expressed is not so awesome. For example, you know, speech that we may perceive, and when I say we as individuals, we as small groups, we as larger groups, that we may perceive as objectionable, as offensive, fat-shaming, threats, God-damning people. Those are examples of speech that may be objectionable. Why am I giving those exact examples? Because those are also examples of, quote fingers, faculty gone wild on Facebook and Twitter. There are some very well-publicized examples over the recent years of faculty behaving well, according to the social media communications and the traditional press, faculty behaving somewhat badly. For example, a assistant or associate professor at a university in Pennsylvania posted to Facebook seeking discreet hitmen to take out some of her students because it was that kind of day. Of course, that seems a comical post to post on Facebook, but when you're friends with your students or when it's open to be viewed by your administrators, colleagues, etc., it can lead to action against you, even with academic freedoms in place. This professor, in the example of hiring a discreet, not an overt hitman, I mean, she did at least frame it as a discreet hitman, but that led to a consequence of her being suspended. So there we go. Because something is a right or a freedom, like freedom of expression, it doesn't mean it's without consequence. And, you know, that Facebook post or that bad tweet or objectionable tweet, when we consider Google, when we consider Control-Shift-4, or the ease in which we can copy and paste and save anything that's out on the web, the evidence lives on that we did this even long after we've taken action to intentionally delete it. And this plays well into my terms of service issues and concerns when I think about implementing social media and social networking into my own classes. For example, fat shaming. Some of you may have seen this example. Dr. Jeffrey Miller, an associate professor at the University of New Mexico, visiting professor at NYU when he sent out this tweet. He deleted it, but I just pulled it off the web this morning. His consequence, he was censured. He was not censured for this tweet by the University of New Mexico because with academic freedom, with other, you know, sort of blurred boundaries of policies in place, we may not know what actions we might take against a faculty member or student who somebody perceives their expression as objectionable. The reason he was censored was because he claimed this was research, that he was doing it to see what kind of reaction he would get. If you're going to claim to do human subjects research, you better have a research protocol on file, and he did not, hence the censoring. Now, here's David Guth from the University of Kansas. This was his tweet after the Navy Yard shooting. He was, and this is the goddamning part, he was suspended for a month by the University of Kansas for this tweet. It actually also led to a lot of reform by the Kansas Board of Regents for their faculty and students on appropriate communications. In university settings, we do have some codes of some guidance already in place, like codes of conduct, honor codes. However, research has shown that we have very few policies relating to social networks and social media. And that's, again, part of an impetus for my research. And just a couple things I want to leave you with as I finish up. What challenges our communications via social networking sites in higher education, as well as throughout your personal and professional life, even in consideration of academic freedom and codes of honor, which may challenge each other, this notion of dual relationships. As a faculty member, as a student, you have multiple roles that you play with your different faculty, with your different students you engage with. I may be an instructor, I may also be an advisor, a mentor, a supervisor. Now, consider my relationships then outside of my professional context. This is where we get to context collapse, enabled via social networking sites and social media. This is a flattening of the boundaries. It might have been that my colleague at the university would never meet my parents, would never meet my 11-year-old horrible niece who Instagrams the worst stuff ever, would never meet my college friends who have digitized photos of me during my college days. They would never meet in real life, but in Facebook, context has collapsed, and now all of those different people can come together. I mentioned the digitized photos of me in college. Identity management, another big consideration. So that is, what content do you contribute and what content do you control? Content that's about you and by you, content that's about you by others, such as those photos of me from college that have been posted, and content that's about others by you. And again, terms of service, I just want to leave you on this. An area of mine is digital preservation. Here you go. For those of you Facebooking, you've agreed to this. So here's my question. Do you even know what this means? Non-exclusive, not transferable, sub-licensable, royalty-free? We agree to things that we might not know what we've agreed to. Who can tell me your 6 exclusive rights under the U.S. Copyright Act, Section 108? Right? Hey, guess what? You just gave those to Facebook. So that's a challenge, and that's one of the reasons I don't use this type of content in my classroom, because I don't think that I should tell students what they have to agree to. Also, you know, hey, you might delete your content, but guess what? If you shared it, it doesn't mean everybody's deleted it, and more from Facebook's terms of service. You know, sure, it's deleted, but hey, remember, this works just like your recycle bin on your laptop. It may be deleted, it may be withdrawn, but is it gone forever? No, as you just showed from those tweets I shared. So here you go. I just want to end on this. It's a balancing act, right, between freedom of expression and responsible communications. I like this quote from Montana Miller. He gave this in response to the Hitman Facebook post. In that scenario, it's easy to offend someone. Facebook is one big open mouth. At every turn, we put a foot in it. These are some considerations that I'll leave you with. Feel free to have a look. Again, consider your digital footprint. Think before you post, and share not just what's about you, but what's about others by you. Be aware who and where you are today is not who or where you are tomorrow. Consider your own personal brand and communication plan. Some sources, if you're interested, I'll make sure these are available, and getting to the who you are today and where you'll be tomorrow. So the origins of my Facebook profile pics over time. You see there Carolyn Hank, the assistant professor who does like to dye her hair, down here at the bottom. But look at that. I'm also somebody who has tried to not have bangs, who wears sequins, who claps wildly at basketball games, and yes, who should never be asked to hold a baby. So there we go. Thank you.
Next up, we have Dr. Nick Bowman.
All right, thank you. See if we're in. I tend to make very big PowerPoint slides, 8, 10, 20 megabits, because I think that it's a renewable resource, right? So thank you, and wonderful first presentation. And in fact, in many ways, I'm also going to talk about outside of class Facebook usage in a way that I think challenges some of the assertions about what social media is. I mean, a lot of us talk about its distracting, antisocial, corrosive nature on human communication. And one of the themes from Social Media Week that I've really been pleased to see is this role that social media is a tool. Tools don't have a valence. They're not inherently good. They're not inherently bad. They're things that we do to do things. I gave the example yesterday that if a welder were to hand me his toolkit, I would probably think it's silly and weird looking. But if he handed another welder his toolkit, they might go, oh my gosh, that's a great rig. Let's go do some welding. If you don't understand the tool, you're in a weird place to judge it, right? And so I've been really pleased to hear people across the spectrum of politics, psychology, counseling, newspapers talk about the tool. So I'm going to talk today about the social classroom, but I'm also going to suggest that we rethink what a classroom might possibly be, right, over the next couple minutes. So I'm going to talk about two studies, one that I've already done that is published, one that I started working on about 4 days ago, because I thought I needed more stuff in the presentation. Okay. And the first one I want to talk about is this beast, Facebook. And by the way, I'm really glad, Dr. Hank, that you pointed out the TOS, because it's one that we don't spend much time educating. Now, on the flip side, I come from the background in the assertion that if they're already on, at some degree, they're already in. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that they're on there. But I do also recognize we need to do a better job explaining information literacy. But what I do want to talk about here is the mass lecture. How many of you guys are in a mass lecture, have attended a mass lecture? How many students in it do you think? Over 100? Anybody over 2? Okay, over 3? Over 4? So I teach a class at West Virginia University of between 340 and 375. It's the Introduction to Mass Media course, right? It's the show. It's where I use my radio broadcasting experience and just go into radio voice and, broadcast play-by-play each slide, right? Well, mass lectures are a historical and integral part of the university, and that's great, but they can leave students disengaged and disenfranchised. And I don't think we need to get rid of them. Look, they work for lots of different reasons, But just because something works doesn't mean it's the best fix. We also know that from an administrative standpoint, we need them. They're cost-effective, they're efficient, they translate lots of information to lots of people at one time. Anybody freshman, sophomore in the room, it gets you into your major, because then you can take that basic information and go follow it up in a smaller class, in a senior level class, right? But of course, if the professor has to use a mic, that's a sign. I mean, you down there need to listen to what I am saying, and don't talk, ever. Or I will say, any questions? No, you're not going to raise your hand. There's 4. Even if you had a question, how are you going to ask it? There's not mic stands set up in the lecture hall, right? So we know this happens. We know we use them. And it might, coming from a social networking, social media background, I take a look at this. I'm in communication studies. I do, the intersection of comm-tech and the human experience. Well, let's think of a mass lecture as a social network that looks like this. You've got one-to-many communication. I'm the purple dot. Actually matches my sweater today. You've got me telling y'all what to do for a predetermined amount of time, right? They're very efficient, and what you end up getting, though, is something like this, where it's join us, but us is me and the quiet folk in the room, right? And I talk, and you guys attempt to listen, and doesn't always go very well, and I'm going to guess some of your experiences in the mass lecture are sort of very much transcribing the lecture to memorize something for the next day, right? Common complaints, lack of cognitive engagement. It's very hard to feel talked to, and as a result, it's very hard to engage material that you're transcribing, if that makes any sense. Anybody who's done some news reporting, one of the hardest parts of learning how to be a journalist, for example, was taking the notes and processing the story at the same time, and not getting so wrapped up in your notes that you forget that you're watching a game, right? That's why I did baseball. It's slow. Love baseball, easy to cover, get to talk a lot on the radio. Lack of attendance. Attendance and quotations, because, look, you guys show up, but you don't show up. There's shells in the room of people that are just sort of going through the motions. You swipe your ID card so you don't get penalized for not being there, but you're not there, right? And then you have a lack of P-to-P connectedness, peer-to-peer, peer-to-professor. There really is no facilitation of conversation. Again, that's not the point of the network. Okay. One way we try to fix this is through out-of-class contact. Well, office hours are very restricting. My office isn't that big. I'm an assistant professor. Okay, I can fit 4 of you in there. Study sessions are nice, but again, they have a space requirement and a time requirement, and not everybody's free when I say you should be free. Study sessions go around my schedule, my TA's schedule, because they have to. I have to be there, is the assumption, because the information is coming from the purple guy down to the network. So if purple guy's not there, you guys can't possibly learn. Email is attentionally restrictive, right? Emails take a while to respond to. And unfortunately, we have other things to do during the day, from administrators, from grant bodies, from journals, and things like that. I can't respond back to all the emails. And we have learning management systems, eCampus, Blackboard. You guys have one here, I'm sure. What's it called? Blackboard. But that's not a social network. It's an administrative place for grades and notes. And it could even be artificial to your digital footprint. A lot of students probably talk about having to adopt a new network on top of all the networks they already use. But we can't even get students to use their campus email sometimes. They want to use Yahoo or Gmail. But we can't use those for official communication. So we know a lot of the research on digital migration and digital adoption gets too cumbersome. And as a result, eCampus, which works very well at West Virginia University, at the same time, it's an extra network to go to a different place for a different conversation at a different time. Doesn't fit well into their digital landscape. So what about Facebook? Because as the numbers show, you guys use it. Okay. I argue, and I say I'm not the first person to come up with this, that it's a persistent classroom, or that it could be. That perhaps we could take a technology that students are already active in and give them a space within that space to engage a classroom. It might be a ready space for engagement and relationships. Given the persistent nature of Facebook, a lot of times I'll read surveys and they'll say, how often do you log into Facebook? And to me that's a flawed question, because when do you log out? I've got a tablet there I'm on right now. My phone's constantly logged in. We don't log out. You don't have to log out. That's kind of the point, right? It's a persistent space. with natural usage, and I wonder if it might shape the network from a join us network, us being me, to a join in, to where I still have an important role in the center of the network, but the students can also craft their own groups and communities of learners in ways that I can connect with them in spaces beyond 9 to 10:30 Tuesday and Thursday, right? It might be a classroom commons. It might be a third place of discourse. And so a lot of the research on video games and MMOs, massively multiplayer games, talks about people can gather in these spots in the way they would gather in a coffee house or at a bar, okay, and places like that. So you got my mountaineers circling around me, right? And we do well there, at least is my hypothesis. And I want to point out that there is a lot of research on the negative impact of Facebook on classroom engagement. But what I'll suggest in that research is that it only considers blunt time spent with technology, not how it's used. I'll skip over the main details here, but basically we had a class of 321. They had the chance to voluntarily enroll in a Facebook group, and it was about a 50-50 split, okay? We found students posted about 6 to 7 posts on average. Every time I posted something, they posted about 2 to 3 times more than me, okay? One student posted 81 times. She was a super user, okay? And in fact, if you look at this distribution, you have a couple super users. We know in social networks that we have lurkers, people who jump into a network and don't engage. That's fine, they're still learning. And my evidence of that is here. The people who joined the group had a class average of about 79%. The people who didn't scored about 72. Now, you might say, well, sure, they self-selected. I'm going to argue that half my students are not motivated. That's not any offense to students. But half of them are not motivated. And there wasn't a correlation between how much you posted and your grade. The super users were the motivated students. The girl who posted 81 times did just fine in the class. But being in that Facebook group gave you a space to engage course content outside the room on your own time, and it was always there. And it wasn't me talking all the time. It was them talking to each other, okay? And then there's some other things they did. They talked to each other. Very few negative comments. I only had 17 negative comments in my evaluations. None mentioned technology. Only had 1 negative comment on the entire board, and it was a student complaining about the test being hard. So that fear of students will revolt and tear down your wall. There's a thing in research called trust your neighbor. And when you have an academic group like this, there isn't a whole lot of fear in that situation. And the papers go into some more detail. They contacted each other. They contacted the content. It was a double dose of content from multiple perspectives. And to follow up on this, I'm going to skip over some of this for now. I want to show you a Twitter map, which is my latest area of work. So the Facebook one argued that they talk to each other outside the space, they share the material, and as a result, they get more access to more content in their own natural spaces, and as a result, they're learning more. They're learning more. And these were grades. These weren't, did you feel like you learned more? This was their actual scores. On Twitter, we're seeing something similar with the added bonus of live conversation. And I want to show you a tweet map from my current class, which is my Com 425 class, which is a course on CMC, Computer Media Communication. Of 34 students, 13 of them use the hashtag WVU Com 425. Has anybody studied a two-step flow model of communication in class yet? This notion that most of us don't get information directly from the source. We get it from a person who gets it from the source. I want you to look at this map. It's hard to see, right? The nodes are kind of small. And in fact, if you're interested, I can show you the live visualization of this. This is one example where this group over here, all of these are outside of the classroom. CNN, JCPenney, W Crushes, which is one of our weird dating websites. Grab this guy real quick. We've got Time Magazine. We've got professors from other universities. This barrier here are students enrolled in my class. And that's me. They're finding things. They're finding things from the news. They're finding things from other professors. They're finding things from other campus organizations. They're sending those tweets into each other, and those tweets are going back to me. And it's providing a space to engage in discourse that I wouldn't have otherwise had or expected. So I'm still working with this data. And in fact, this program allows you to do to do a replay of a tweet stream. So I can set the parameters from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., and it will live play the tweets at the bottom of the screen, and then it will draw this map for me again. I've put this on the hashtag for Social Media Week if you're interested. But to wrap things up, the point I want to make is that social media can serve as a supplemental course activity. Supplemental. It doesn't replace the classroom. And kind of like you said, it's an outside activity. But it allows us to share content. It allows us to build conversations around content. And it allows us to grow groups that generate their own content. It's like having 400 TAs that you don't have to manage. Thanks.
Thank you, Nick. Now, Dr. Karen Freberg.
Hard acts to follow. Cool. Well, thank you. It is a pleasure to be back here at the University of Tennessee. And I was thinking the other day when the last time I was at UT to do a presentation, and I realized it was for my dissertation. So I'm a lot more relaxed now, still caffeinated, but definitely good time. So it's great to be back here at good old Rocky Top. So just to give you guys a little bit of a background on my part, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Louisville. It's taken me a while to pronunciate that correctly. I always want to say Louisville. But I got my PhD here at UT, very proud of that. And before then, I was a master's student at the University of Southern California. Kind of get mixed up between the other SC. And then, I'm sorry, I was a Gator. So, but yeah, so that's kind of my background. But I've always been passionate about emerging technology, and that was one of the things that I really focused in on here at the University of Tennessee and learned a great deal. And I have to give a shout out to Dr. Childers, who allowed me to be her TA for her social media class, and the lessons that I learned in that classroom are what I've been able to use at the University of Louisville. So you students that are in her class right now, she's awesome. And so one of the things that I wanted to kind of focus on, I really appreciate Carolyn and Nick for your great, insightful, presentations, talking about the research and how do you use social media in the classroom. My presentation is a little bit different because I've gotten this question over the years, especially for the holidays, where my other relatives, they're like, so you teach social media. Does that mean you're on Facebook and Twitter, and what else do you do? And so I thought, okay, there's certain perceptions and myths about professors that teach social media, so I wanted to come up with 4 that I've heard pretty much on a regular basis, and what are some best practices and lessons that I've learned teaching the social media class at the University of Louisville. And I'm really glad, Carolyn, you brought up and Nick, you guys brought up the point of you can't be friends with your students on Facebook. I've gotten that a lot, and people have asked me what my point of view is on that. And I said, yeah, I think it depends on the students involved, but I do want to give them the open door to basically say, yeah, you're more than welcome to friend me on Facebook, on Twitter, and I'm all over the place too. So I'm pretty much on all social media platforms. So I tell the students, do what you feel comfortable. If you want to see what I post on Instagram, and I warn them, it's Angry Birds and coffee. I like those 2 areas. But I basically tell them ahead of time, look, you will be able to see what I see. I might be boring, and just post the same things on a regular basis. I try to keep things professional, but I also let them know I get to see what you guys see. I get to see what you're posting and what you're doing with your friends, but I give them the open door with that policy. But you do want to have a certain level of policy in your class to see whether or not you will take friend requests. And I've actually had a lot more students do that because they want to see me not only as a professor, but as a person. And they're like, well, and over the years, people have said, well, we actually think you're interesting as a professor. I'm like, well, I hope so. I hope so. But I think also open up and showcase your interest in humor. I think that's what makes us memorable for students. And I've had a lot of times with students tell me in the past in my social media class that they feel like they really got to know me not only as a professor but as a person, which I think that's really key. And then share class updates and contents that are personalized, that's relevant to your students. So if they feel like you're sharing relevant content that's interesting to them, maybe for jobs or internships, they would be more likely to be engaged with the content. And I think, too, for me, I've learned this. I do a lot of experimentation to see what works, what doesn't. And I don't necessarily use Facebook for my classes. I use Twitter. And I ask that at the beginning of each semester for my social media class, like what platform outside of class do you want to engage in? And everyone has said Twitter. So I've basically focused on that, and I've asked them why not Facebook, and they're like, well, our parents are on Facebook. I'm like, okay, totally understandable. But I think too, professors, one thing that I hear a lot of times is, from others, professors can't showcase their personality on social media. They feel like they have to be professional all the time. And if that was true, I would kind of fail at that test. But I can definitely do that. So here are just some of the images that I use Instagram a lot in my classes because I feel like my students get really engaged with visual content, not just necessarily Twitter updates and links and articles, but they love the fact that there's visuals as part of it. So these are just a couple of screenshots that I have. I have motivational quotes for my students, especially with their final projects coming up. I feel like I have to do that on a regular basis, motivating them. But I also showcase guest speakers, clients, and the overall experience in the class. And they feel like that showcases a personality that they can rebrand, repurpose, reshare, and tell others, hey, look what we're experiencing in this class. So I try to give that an open door to that policy. And the other thing, too, that I get a lot is people ask me, well, how do you have this much time to engage your students on a regular basis? Because I use Twitter a lot, and I'm a guilty user of that. And I've had other friends tell me, well, I don't have time. I don't have time to be on social media and engage. But you do have time, I think. Planning is essential. For me, I schedule out tweets, especially like if I know throughout the semester that I'm going to be doing certain assignments. I send out reminders, but it's part of my natural routine. If I see something that's relevant for my class, I'm going to share it immediately. But using sites like Hootsuite or TweetDeck, really, you're able to plan ahead articles that and relevant content that you have available. And so also, if you know that you're going to be having certain guest speakers coming to play, you could schedule out reminders. Hey, we're going to have a guest speaker coming through. I have one coming in my class on Friday, so that's one of the things that I'm doing. It's like, remember, bring questions. We're going to be live tweeting. We're going to be engaged in the conversations. Follow up, do your research ahead of time. So I can plan out those accordingly, but there are also opportunities that I'm able to share on-the-spot content that's relevant. And the last myth that I have here is there's only one way to approach using social media and incorporate it in the classroom. I get that a lot. Like there's a certain assignments that you have to have, certain books, certain protocols, certain expectations. And my philosophy is, okay, who made up that rule? Honestly. Because I think, looking at the class that I have right now, it's constantly changing. We have a professor in information science, we have a professor in communication studies, and I'm in PR. We all are teaching, approaching, and studying and researching some similar aspects, but we're approaching it differently. And I think for us as a professor, we have to set the tone and set the example for students. And so all of the assignments that I have my students do, I do along with them. I blog. I do strategic briefs. I'm doing my own campaign proposals. So I'm telling them, look, as an old professor, I tell them, I joke, I'm like, yes, I'm old, and so I tell them, if I can do it, you can do it as well. So I'm basically a partner in learning overall in the experience. So I do think it's important to combine the science with the art, theory, and practice. You do want to share with the students the theories, the implications, how this kind of is extending your traditional PR theory, communications theory, to kind of build the foundation, but you also want to give them opportunities to showcase how it's being applied, how are businesses, how are organizations using it, and what are some of the things that practitioners are using and implementing. And that kind of raised the point of creativity sparks innovation. I would say being creative, providing assignments that haven't been done for the students. It might be, you might be alone in this, but you definitely want to be creative because once you get that brainstorming process going, you could really interject, a conversation with other professors to kind of spark to see what works and what doesn't. And I think the most important thing is don't be afraid to reach out for others. As the professor, especially if we're working on this in social media, there's no harm in reaching out to practitioners or professionals and say, hey, would you be willing to Skype into my class? Have you looked at my syllabus? And I did that my first year at the University of Louisville. I spent the entire year kind of designing my class. And when I came up with the syllabus, I actually didn't share it with any professors. I went directly to the practitioners and asked them, if you had a student applying for a job or an internship that took a class like this, would you hire them? And everyone came back and said yes. And the biggest coup for me was when I had Jason Falls, who's a local Louisville professional, very colorful in his language. I sent him my syllabus, and I said, well, what do you think? And I was kind of anticipating some colorful feedback, but he said, I think you're doing a good job, and I would take this class. So I thought, awesome. But when I mean about reaching out to others, it's about, for us as a professor, proving to the students, yes, we not only will give you the tools available to succeed out in the classroom, but show them also the opportunities outside of the classroom. I have 2 screenshots here. On the left-hand side, we have a tweet showcasing a campaign using Google Glass, and I do have my pair, so if you guys want to test them out, I'd be more than happy to do that. But I got Google Glass last summer, and I wanted to use it, of course, for the classroom because it's wearable technology. This is one of the things that, people are talking about. But I also viewed it as an opportunity for the university to get a showcase. And so this is a screenshot of Luke Hancock, who is our co-captain. We had a pretty good basketball team last year. Basketball is a big thing in Louisville, if you haven't noticed. But he wore Google Glass to record his experience of the unveiling of our national championship brand. And Nick Stover, who's our director of social media, also a UT grad. He got his master's here in sports administration, I believe. But he said usually on a typical basis, they get 100, 200 views, for initial views. This got over 15,000 in a day. So people were really captivated about that. And then reaching out to others on the left-hand side is my former student, Lizelle, who's the social media coordinator for the Dallas Mavericks. So she was able to come into our class through Skype, and she's actually sitting in the locker room. So we got to see some of the players come in, so that was pretty cool. But again, social media as a professor, you're able to still get connected with characteristics. And engaging with fellow professors, showing them, what you're doing in the classroom, being generous with the feedback. So I've been able to kind of share content, not only create a community in my classroom, but also share it and help others with other professors to kind of build that network and being a resource as a professor. And then also sustain student community. It's about encouraging students living through social media, how to use it professionally, but also you're creating a community. So I have a hashtag that I use on Twitter called Freberg14. My class number at the University of Louisville is COM460. That was already taken as a hashtag. But you kind of get to show like the difference, that your students have by sharing this willingly on Twitter, and they're able to kind of pass out that word of mouth as well. So I want to just kind of end on a final note with best practices for professors. Lead by example, like your students will follow. Like definitely be engaged with the new media. Be generous with your information. So if any of you are interested in my class materials, assignments, syllabus, please let me know. I'd be happy to send it to you. It might be big files because I like a lot of images and videos, but I'd be more than happy to do that. Adapt and prep. You're always prepping for this type of class. It's changing so much. I'm already doing things for next year. And definitely give shout outs to students and others on social media. Be generous, be engaging, because first and foremost, social media is social. So you really want to make sure to be following those practices. And so I guess we'll open it up for panels and questions. So thanks, everyone.
Panelists, can we have you come sit up here? And I'll bring the mic around. Who has a question?
Hi, good morning. I noticed in one of the slides, it was the Twitter map that Dr. Bowman put on. I was looking at the Twitter aliases to see kind of what people had on there, because a lot of times that can be interesting. Yeah, I think you had Steel City Arab was one. And then I noticed one was, hey Prof Bow. And that kind of leads into this question. For people who are scared to have that relationship where they have their own privacy at home or their privacy on social media, and they don't necessarily want the professors to see it, do you encourage them to make unique profiles on Twitter or on Facebook or on other social media so they can be a part of the process but not necessarily have photos of them not liking little kids and other things like that out where everybody can see it?
Right. So I'm always careful, of course, because we had the discussion about, it's always dicey with terms of service if you're allowed to have a not you profile. But at the same time, I also mentioned to folks that in that process, I would never not encourage it, right? Because, and it's what you said at the very end of your comment, that one of the important bits here is making sure that the students can be part of the conversation. And they shouldn't have to. Sure. Better? All right. The question was asking about this notion of making students be conspicuous online in order to be part of the conversation, because so many of these social networks require you to be yourself, or you have to be your Facebook profile or your Twitter account. And I always want to make sure that they can protect themselves and their information and their anonymity if they want in the beginning, right? So what I usually do is I strongly encourage them to think about other ways they can represent themselves without putting them in trouble with just straight out saying, make a fake Twitter page, right? But as you saw, there are some on there where students are definitely jumping in. And I don't have the data in front of me, but if I were to poll my class quickly and see how many of them use their natural account versus a created account, you would find that a decent number of students are using created accounts. I also find, however, that some of those students tend to struggle with it a little bit. Because at least my approach is that I'm trying to use a space they already exist in. So the students who tend to benefit from this are students who are already heavily engaged in social. And that presents a bit of a rich get richer effect, right? Where it's the kids who are already online that are doing better. It's one of the reasons why I make the project supplemental. It's one of the reasons why I don't give them credit for participating in any way, shape, or form. But it is in the back of my head. How can we teach more information literacy? How can we protect students? I love the TOS discussions. Should they know what they're getting into? But I would never require a student to be my friend. Or, in fact, in the class, I tell them we don't have to be connected to be on Facebook. You don't have to be one of my followers to follow a hashtag. It's why I use a hashtag instead of a tweet, for example. So a long answer, but it's a question that I haven't quite grappled with. But it's important students can make that choice. And it's also important they're not getting left behind. And so I also find myself bringing the conversations back into class, using those charts, spending 5-10 minutes and going over the Twitter map. I like how you said at the end that it does take a lot of work on the instructor's part. But if you're into the stuff, you're into the stuff.
I find it a huge challenge for me because I have my own personal Twitter and my own personal everything, but then I have my at UT Turfgrass that I use for my job and I use for work, and I find sometimes I forget which one I'm on, and I'll make a comment or I'll tweet something, and then all of a sudden it'll pop up and I'll see, oh, the University of Tennessee Turf Program thinks this, and I'm like, oh no, I don't. Right. I mean, it's nothing. Usually nothing too inflammatory, but at the same, I haven't gotten fired yet, so I'm doing okay. But I find that to be really hard to maintain, and that's why when I noticed there were other tweets, I was curious how that works with people using different aliases. So
I'm okay with it, and I invite anybody to the conversation, though. I mean, that was one of my arguments, is that anybody can be part of this conversation. If the information gets bad, that's my job to filter it out. If it starts getting to where they're getting off derailed. Which, by the way, that is one of the things you have to look out for, is you have to monitor a little more. Not for censorship, but to make sure the information's accurate. When your students are posting 3 times as much as you are, you want to make sure they understand the core concept, because otherwise you're going in. If anybody's taught an online class, it's very similar, where you teach from a very kind of reactive standpoint. But it's a great question, and it's one that I like that my students have that choice. So.
Well, and I think just to play off that a little bit, because I think it was great to start pessimistically with me in a way, to optimism, right? And I'm presenting some extreme examples. Cancel Colbert. That people heard about the cancel Colbert. So very similar to the scenario you just presented, right? That it wasn't an account he controlled. If you want him, you go to Stephen at Home, etc. But so my pessimism is just to start thinking about ways that we haven't considered all of the ramifications for this. It doesn't mean that we're going to get bitten in the ass or anything, right? But there are these underlying principles and concerns for these implications for our behaviors. I do think it's interesting when we think about when we think about this notion that we've been communicating, it's typically closed and confined. So not only are we broadcasting now, but again, these traces we leave evidence. And I think that really fundamentally alters our communication patterns and, you know, the faculty, again, placing in the context of higher education, these faculty-student interactions. If I suspect that, you know, if I was working in a high school or if I was working in a daycare and I suspected concern for a student or a charge in a daycare and you saw that picture, I won't be allowed in a daycare. To explain myself, that was my niece who had been crying for 4 hours, and you should know she's been crying for 7 years now. Are we recording this so I can play this back for my brother? But where I got distracted with my joke. Where was I going? 7 years crying. What was I saying?
Wouldn't have gotten a job in a daycare.
Oh, right. But no, but in one of those settings, if I saw behavior happening on Facebook or another social media, pictures of cutting, other evidence of bullying, I am obligated to respond. That changes once we all hit, you know, the age of adult and consent. So that's an additional. I investigate social networking and social media. I don't use it. And that's why I really liked your myths, because I saw myself playing in some of those myths. And also, unfortunately, I want to avoid scenarios that I don't want to place myself in. Not just hearing about a student who's having a bad day, you know, who's doing upside-down cake stands with their dogs, and they then get arrested, if you heard about that, those tweet pictures from 2 or 3 weeks ago. But also, not just my concern for my students and what is my professional obligation as well as my moral obligation to respond, but also my colleagues who are at a bar, at a conference, doing Jell-O shots, you know, with some of their undergraduates who are there pushing paper forms. So that was my long aside.
Well, I think, too, it raises the question of the reputation of a professor. And I've been online pretty much for 20 years. And I tell my students I used to throw things for a living as the shot putter. But so I remember the first couple of days of class, I had a few students that were very shy to talk to me. And I thought, okay, what did I do? And they said, well, Dr. Freberg, we Googled you. I'm like, okay. And they said, and they pulled up this picture. And I'm like, well, yeah. I mean, it was pretty scary. It was pretty scary, and I'm like, okay, that was me in competition mode. This is me pretty much 99.9% of the time, but they do judge you on those first impressions, so that's really something that we have to look at. Oh,
yeah. And that goes back to identity management of what you were referring to as well, and even if we're anonymous, even if we create false personas, again, the pessimist here, it's like research. Why do we de-identify our research subjects? Because if you recorded enough fields, I'd eventually maybe be able to trace it back to you. Yeah. We may use anonymous content, but guess what? You leave a lot of traces behind. Yeah. So are you ever really anonymous? No.
We are out of time today. Thank you so much for all three of our speakers. And we do have a gift to give you on behalf of UT Social Media Week. So thank you very much. Have a great day.